one of the worst dictators humanity has ever seen. Joseph Stalin. Millions of people died during his reign. Mass murders, labor camps, mass arrests, and the worst part, the artificially induced famine that claimed millions of lives in Ukraine. Estimates of the total number of victims of his regime range from 6 to 20 million people. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because what if their regime didn't stop at the borders of a single country? What if it took over the whole world? May 1945. The worst conflict in human history has just ended. 60 million dead, millions homeless, industry destroyed, currencies worthless, trust in the pre-war order shattered, just like the cities. In our reality, communist parties would have taken power only in those areas reached by the Red Army in Eastern Europe. In the West, one thing in particular would stop them. The Marshall Plan, US economic aid, worth approximately $13 billion, would have injected enough capital into the devastated economies of France, Italy, and West Germany. Enough capital to prevent the communist parties, which would have been very popular in 1945, thanks to their role in the resistance. Fortunately, they never made it into the governments of Western countries. But what if that aid had not arrived? Let's imagine the US Congress in 1947, war-weary, inward-looking, and convinced that Europe was the Europeans' problem. Without US dollars, the French and Italian economies would continue to decline. Inflation would erode savings, unemployment would rise, and communist parties, with millions of members and strong support from the unions, could legitimately win the election at the polls. By 1948, instead of a Cold War between East and West, a situation could have arisen in which all of continental Europe would have been looking toward Moscow. If Europe were to fall, the global balance of power would be irreversibly shifted. China would have undergone a revolution in 1949 anyway. That would not have changed. But without a strong capitalist Japan to act as a counterweight, the US would have fewer resources for its reconstruction. And without French Indochina defending itself with American support, communist movements, Korea and Indonesia could have gained the upper hand more quickly and with less resistance. Decolonization. This would have been a pivotal moment. Countries that were shaking off colonial rule in the 1950s and 1960s, India, Algeria, Ghana, Kenya, would face a simple choice: ties to their former colonial masters or an alliance with the communist bloc, which would offer them weapons, advisors, and the ideology of anti-colonialism. Gradually, everyone will join the communist bloc. Latin America. Without a strong United States as a regional hegemon, the Cuban Revolution of 1959 would not have been an isolated case, but the first of many. Imagine Guatemala, Chile, Brazil, all following a similar path during the 1960s. By the mid-1970s, the United States would thus have remained the last major capitalist state in the world, economically isolated, commercially encircled, with growing internal tensions between those who would like to defend the system and those who would see it as nothing more than a failed minority stronghold. Internal collapse, not an invasion, would likely have brought about a revolution there as well, sometime around 1975 to 1978, driven by economic isolation and the loss of trading partners around the world. This would be the moment when the story would become truly interesting and when the biggest theoretical problem with this scenario would become apparent. In our reality, no communist state has ever functioned in complete isolation from the capitalist world. Soviet planners were able to indirectly monitor world prices. Since the 1970s, China has been actively copying Western technologies. Even today, North Korea survives thanks to smuggling and the black market along the Chinese border. But a world where capitalism didn't exist anywhere, where there would be no reference prices, no capital flight, no comparisons. Economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek would call this the problem of calculation under socialism. Without free market prices, central planners would not know how much steel, shoes, or bread to produce. This could result in a shortage of everyday goods, stores with empty shelves, like those we remember from Moscow in the 1970s, but all over the world. Unified communism would probably not have been as unified as it might seem. History gives us a clear indication. In fact, Moscow and Beijing had a sharp falling out in the 1960s over who was the true bearer of Marxism-Leninism, a rift so deep that it led to armed clashes along the border in 1969. In our scenario, this rift would likely not disappear. On the contrary, without a common capitalist enemy to hold the communist bloc together, at least formally, the rivalry could intensify. Instead of communism versus capitalism, the world could thus be divided into a Soviet sphere of influence and a Chinese sphere of influence, each with its own ideological interpretation, its own allies, and its own Cold War. Housing. It would be allocated by the state based on family size and social need. Private ownership of rental properties would not exist. The workforce planning system would determine where you would work based on your education and the needs of the economy, not on your personal preferences. Unemployment in the traditional sense would be virtually non-existent because the state would guarantee employment. Well, efficiency and motivation would be a topic that would constantly be brought up. Traveling to another part of the world would require a permit, just as it did in the USSR before 1991, or, to this day, in North Korea. Education and healthcare, free for all, with a strong emphasis on the technical and scientific fields necessary for a planned economy. Religion. Historically, communist states would have suppressed religion as the opium of the people. On a global scale, this would have meant pressure on billions of believers, from Catholics to Muslims to Hindus, which would likely have been one of the greatest sources of internal resistance and underground movements. Movies, music, and literature would be subject to censorship and would have to convey an ideological message, much as was the case with Soviet socialist realism in the art. Progress or stagnation? This is a question on which historians and economists still disagree today. The Soviet space program, from the launch of the first artificial satellite to the sending of the first human into space, demonstrated that a centrally planned economy can achieve extraordinary results when it concentrates vast resources on a single strategic and prestigious goal. But personal computers, the internet, and smartphones' inventions that would have emerged from the chaotic, decentralized competition among thousands of private companies and garage enthusiasts in Silicon Valley might be absent from this world, or might have appeared decades later. A world under a single communist regime would not be the utopia its founders dreamed of in the 19th century. History consistently shows us one thing: power concentrates and corrupts, no matter what ideology is used to seize it.